tonight we're going to talk about objective number 15. So these Cornell notes on which you're taking notes can be numbered 15. And we're going to talk about radical movements in Latin America after World War II. So you can label your notes that. So we've been talking most of this week about the Cold War and the tensions happening in Europe between both, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but also primarily the Soviet Union and the United States. What's really important to note about the Cold War is, I would argue, it's a global war, and so it extends far beyond just Europe and Russia and the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union and the United States. So, while the Cold War and our tensions in Berlin and the Berlin airlift are going on in Europe, we have Latin America. So meanwhile, in Latin America, the movements and conflicts of the Cold War spread to the Americas. And we'll get to this, but the American worst nightmare comes true, which is that communism spreads to its back door. And so we'll get to that. So again, Latin America, 1914 to present, and U.S. involvement. We're going to discuss a little bit number 16, the relationship between U.S. and nations of Latin America, but we're going to go into more detail on that tomorrow. So the United States influence in Latin America. Before you read, take a look at the political cartoon. You have Uncle Sam holding a big stick called the Monroe Doctrine and spreading his influence all the way from Alaska down to Argentina. So after World War I, the U.S. solidifies its position as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. You have the Monroe Doctrine that says, Europe, leave the Western Hemisphere up to us. You may not get involved in Latin American happenings and economics. That is our territory. And so essentially we, the U.S., replace European nations as chief investors in Latin America. And we talked about this in class, but just to remind you, when we talk about foreign investment, we mean foreign nations and foreign corporations going in to other nations and building factories, setting up their businesses. So for example, a bunch of Nike clothing or Levi's are made in China, and that's foreign investment. Levi's, all these companies, Nike, have built factories in China. They employ Chinese workers, but the revenue, all the money and the profit of selling those products goes back to the United States. So there's some benefit to the foreign country, but it's not 100% helpful. But we also talked about the infrastructure that gets built when somebody invests. So I'm trying to think of a fruit company. Some food company wants to set up a farm in Mexico. So to set up that farm and get their goods produced, or coffee company in South America, etc. To get their goods produced, they might need to build roads, they might need to bring electricity to that region, etc. So in some ways it helps build infrastructure, etc. and whatnot. But the United States, anyways, I trying to digress. The United States becomes the chief investor in Latin America. Even though they claim to be anti-imperialist and anti-colonization, in a sense, there's very much imperial behavior going on by the United States. So here's another example of the Monroe Doctrine. We have Roosevelt marching his ship of protectors, debt collection, right? All the ship labels, it says the protector, the debt collector, etc., across the Caribbean. You have Mexico, you have Cuba, Santo Domingo, Panama, etc. And so in a way, we are very much a colonizer, even if we haven't replaced the government. So in South America, you have private investments by U.S. companies. So again, that's what I was just describing. And loans from the American government. The American government wants these countries to be stable. We want them to be trading partners. And so we're always willing not just to give money, but to give loans to countries surrounding us and countries we want to help. And you see that with rebuilding after World War II. In Cuba and Puerto Rico, there is direct U.S. involvement, which means the U.S. government is involved. It's similar to protectorate status. You might note that today that situation is still true with Puerto Rico, but not with Cuba, and that's something we're going to focus on today. So they're almost like colonies, but not quite. And in Central America and the Caribbean, you have frequent military interventions by the U.S. government to protect U.S. property and investments. So if we gave a loan to a country, we don't want it to fall to pieces because it's not going to be able to rebuild that loan. If we have a huge company situated in a certain country, we don't want civil war there because it would mean that country or company would fall apart. And so we go in and militarily intervene when we decide it is good for us. And so the U.S. has more than 30 direct interventions before 1933. So after World War I, we very much switched from our isolationist policies and become kind of the leader and the ruler of the Western Hemisphere. So, the United States and Latin America. Our direct intervention in conflicts was followed by the establishment of governments that would be friendly to U.S. interests. So, if there was going to be a civil war or it looked like maybe a leader would be overthrown, we would then make sure the next leader was going to do what we said and work with us and support our ideas. Oftentimes, these were conservative dictatorships. They were not democracies. They were strong tyrannical governments that were not often mistreated their people, and they became sort of our bedfellows or our friends. And what the term that it got called was banana republics, or states that are corrupt or subservient to U.S. interests. We're going to see this happen throughout the Cold War, but the U.S. likes to put in governments that are friendly to it, and that way we can have greater control, we can stop Russia, etc. Similar to what we did in Iraq, or thought we did in Afghanistan. And so we'll get into that. But these states that are corrupt and answer to the U.S. are called banana republics. So we suddenly have this sort of change in U.S. policy. After 1937, we change our approach to Latin America, thanks to Roosevelt. So Roosevelt establishes a good neighbor policy. And it said, we'll be more friendly and we'll stop our direct interventions, and instead you can just come to us when you need help. But I want you to take a look at this political cartoon and look at, there's Uncle Sam, but pay attention to how our Latin American states are portrayed and what the message is. We're almost banging down the door. So, Latin American 20th century leaders play an important role in this conversation. First, we have here Fidel Castro, and this is a speech he's going to give to the U.S. press, and we're actually going to read this speech tomorrow. But I want you to notice, how is Castro dressed and the people around him, and think about why that might be. Castro is noted to almost always be wearing military fatigues. Make a note in your notes about why he might be dressed this way compared to those around him. Again, making his address similar. He's got his leather jacket and his military fatigues underneath on. And I will note, in case you didn't notice this in the reading, Castro is a communist leader. Here's a video I have linked in this open class link, so you can watch this as well. It's not very long, it's about 3 minutes. We have Castro and Che Guevara. And so Castro and Che become very close. They work together in their mission to spread communism because they truly do believe it is what is best for the nations of Latin America. They also almost look like twins. There is the famed Che Guevara, who's known for his motorcycle trips throughout Latin and South America. He rode his motorcycle, tried to spread good faith and the Castro mission. So he's seen almost as a savior in many circles. He was not at all poorly intentioned. He was also not ever a politician or a leader. He was simply trying to spread a message. Take a look at this political cartoon. Kind of describe what you see. So I want you to do the I see and so. So you see Castro. How is Castro portrayed? What does this mean? Notice what he's smoking and what he has in his pocket. Notice the chain and Cuba that Castro is holding. What is being portrayed there? Notice you have Brazil in a cart. The wheel is broken. It looks like the ox that's driving it is almost dying. What does that tell you about Brazil's situation? And you should see the quote, what you need, man, is a revolution like mine. And so what does that tell you is the significance, the message of this cartoon. So what do you see and what does it mean? These are some videos we're going to watch tomorrow. But we have a cartoon because we're going to get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so you read about this, or you're reading about this tonight, but the Cuban Missile Crisis was a time when Khrushchev, who is the bald, angry-looking leader on the right, placed a Soviet missile base in Cuba. And if you're not familiar, Cuba is only 90 miles away from the coast of Florida. And so it says, this hurts me more than it hurts you. And it's Khrushchev talking to Castro. And it's almost like Castro, it gives him teeth having these missiles, for example. And we'll talk about this, but is Khrushchev going to pull those missiles or not? This will be the topic of our discussion tomorrow. Here's another cartoon. I want you to do the I see, what do you see? And so list at least 4 things. So you might see the 2 are arm wrestling. Who is it? What does it mean? You might see what they're sitting on. Who is it? What does it mean? You might see what their fingers are about to do. What does it mean? Okay, so then the U.S. takes a shift after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll go into detail about tomorrow and you read about. We have a policy where we shift back to intervening. No more good neighbor policy. So after World War II, the U.S. grows increasingly concerned with containing communism as well as the influence of the Soviet Union. Castro stepping to power and making our backyard communist makes us very uncomfortable. And so the United States starts to support governments with democratic principles that reject communism. And we use covert methods to undermine governments considered unfriendly to the U.S. interests. Covert methods is a nice way of saying CIA missions to assassinate politicians. This became common practice, that anyone who wasn't working with us, we would overthrow either by killing them ourselves, often assassinating them ourselves, or by funding rebel groups that would overthrow them. Funding and giving arms to. And so when necessary, we would use direct intervention and go in ourselves, but then it would be exceedingly obvious that we were involved and the world community might not like that, and so we avoided it. So here you have Reagan, who is one of the leaders of this idea of intervening covertly. So he tried not to get any blood on his hands ever, and make everything kind of seem like it was happening naturally. And you see he's holding up a Stop Communism in Central America. And then you have Time Magazine article. It's the man who makes Reagan see red or be nervous, right? And it says Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega, because Che's mission is working. South America is rapidly becoming communist. However, the United States keep intervening and overthrowing communist leaders. But you can see here Daniel Ortega, President Ortega has, the hammer and the sickle in his glasses, the reflection, how he's portrayed. Do you think he's dressed like Castro, etc.? Okay, on to more foreign investment. So the famous company, the United Fruit Company, or what used to be called the United Fruit Company, we have a quote: "When the trumpet sounded, all was prepared in the land, and Jehovah divided the world between Coca-Cola Inc., Anaconda, Ford Motors, and other companies. The United Fruit Company reserved for itself the juiciest part, the central coast of my land, the sweet waste of America, and baptized again its lands as banana republics." So this is Pablo Neruda, famous writer and leader in South America. And you can see here that American capitalism is seen as an enemy. This foreign investment, Coca-Cola, Ford Motors, is taking over the world, and it's not seen as a good thing. And so there's a lot of negative ideas around this foreign investment. It sounds like exploitation. You're paying the foreign workers very little. All the profits are going back to the mother country, or the United States. So, Pablo Neruda. There we have some Spanish, his whole quote. If you read Spanish, you can go ahead and enjoy. But he was famous for writing about this topic. Here we have another Time magazine cover, and you have Guatemala's Arbenz. Notice the way he's being portrayed. And the Oppenheimer case, what the loyalty board heard. And so the U.S. governments or companies are having issues with companies in Latin America and them being undermined by the leaders. And you can see this, the portrayal in the back. Take a look. You have some traditional Central American kind of portrayal. How is he being portrayed? That juxtaposed with him being in a suit. Here we have another ad for the bananas, the United Fruit Company, with a gun on it, because a lot of the labor was forced, and treatment of the workers was not very good. They were treatment of the workers was not very good. They were exploited, threatened, etc. And I'll explain that on the next page. Here we go. So we have CIA and Guatemala assassination proposals. Essentially what we did is we assassinated our leader of Guatemala, Arbenz, the man we just saw. And these are declassified documents that show our involvement, how we supported. See the troops on top? Those are American guns that we gave them and helped them remove the president, the leader, Arbenz, from power. Pardon me. And then on the bottom, you can see some of our investment properties. I do want to point out, too, Arbenz was elected. His people voted for him. It's who they decided they wanted to rule. But we decided that was not what was best for them. So, you might be wondering, is this still going on? Could such a company still exist? And the new name, so it doesn't look so evil, for the United Fruit Company is Chiquita. You might have heard of Chiquita Bananas. But yes, it's the old United Fruit Company. So I just want you to think about that when you make purchases, they might have international implications. So when you buy from Chiquita Banana, which sometimes that's the only option I often do. I don't want to say you should not buy Chiquita Bananas, but the reality is that you are supporting our old coup, a military coup to remove unfriendly leaders from power. And by unfriendly, I mean they don't do what the American shareholders or the American companies want. So think about how that's a change. I also, if you've ever seen a Chiquita ad, I want you to think about the female with her hat fruit and how she's dancing and how, the culture is being portrayed. So present day, the U.S. still has concerns. the focus is commerce. It's all about money. Everything we do is worried about our economy. And so we're worried about commerce, immigration, the drug trade, political stability. So we do get involved still when these issues threaten us. 60% of our aid to Latin America is for military purposes, meaning we want the governments to crack down on, harboring terrorists or bringing drugs into our country, etc. And there's high poverty rates that contribute to growing migration to the U.S., both legal and illegal. And a lot of these poverty rates could be argued to be a result of this foreign investment. So the United States invested in land and property in Central America, but it didn't necessarily help Central America run its own business or build its own businesses. Instead, we just kind of exploited the raw materials and did all the industrializing. And so it's been really hard for countries of Latin America, where there was a lot of U.S. commercial influence, to get out of this rut. And so we have a lot of immigration as a result. That is all for tonight. Tomorrow we're going to talk about Cuba and some of these relationships with Latin America and how it relates to the Cold War more directly. Have a good night.